Welcome to our Brainfood Talk and welcome everybody. Nice that you joined our Brainfood Talk. My name is Lisa and I'm a software developer at Square and I will guide you through this session now. So first of all, what is a Brainfood Talk? For us, it's an internal knowledge sharing format, which is usually related to some software development topics. And we usually do it Fridays at lunchtime. Most likely it has to do something to do with our daily work. Yeah, and as I already said, we try to share our knowledge. Now we are happy because we can do it once to twice a month on YouTube, and all of you can join us to this knowledge sharing sessions too. What's the topic of today's Brainfood Talk? It's modern Angular, typed forms, standalone components, and effective state management. The speaker will be Lawrence, who's also a full stack developer at Square, and he will spend like the next one and a half hour with you. We started off by my introduction. I will hand over to Lawrence in just a minute. And we will end this Brainfood Talk by having a short Q&A. So therefore, I would kindly ask you to put the questions into the chat and we will try to answer them in the end so you can get even more insights. Okay, without wasting any more words, I'd like to hand over to Lawrence now. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Lisa, for this introduction. As Lisa mentioned, for this Brainfood Talk, we'll be talking about modern Angular and more specifically about three aspects of modern Angular development. Firstly, typed forms and standalone components, two features that were long awaited in Angular and were finally introduced half a year ago with Angular 14. And then we're going to talk about effective state management, or more specifically, how you can manage your app state effectively with the very popular library NgRx. My name is Lawrence. I'm a software engineer here at Square, and I have a current focus on front-end development with Angular. So without further ado, let's get started with typed forms. To better understand why typed forms were so eagerly awaited, we are first going to have a look at what working with untyped forms looks like if we're using Angular 13. For that, I've created a small application, an app for personal to-dos and goals. And we're going to look specifically into how we create a new to-do by using untyped forms. So let's have a small look at the interface of our application. This is the homepage of our small application, please not to be taken too seriously, where we can look at our to-dos and goals. Here I come to the to-dos overview page. We see each to-do has a title, a description, priority, due to date, and a dynamic number of nodes. And here I can add a to-do, and we will see I have a small form created with Angular material where I can fill in all my properties and then save the form. So now, what does this look like in our IDE? I'm gonna go straight to the to-dos app component. This corresponds to the view that we just saw. So we have here to-do, to-dos app, and to-dos add, and here to-dos add component. So now here right on top, we see the initialization of our to-do form. Now you might wonder, what are all those untyped prefixes here? Untyped form group, it says. This is because this app was created with Angular 15 already, that was just released. And when we're using Angular 14 or 15, our form elements are typed by default. So the Angular team created untyped equivalents for migration purposes from earlier Angular versions. So if you're working with Angular 13 or an earlier version, please have in mind that this is now totally equivalent to what form group was before Angular 14. So we can see with an untyped form group, title is untyped form control, initial state, empty string, and so on. Notes is an untyped form array with empty controls. So now the first thing is basically in untyped forms, how do we make the connection between our form controls and our actual input elements? So when we go here to our template, we can basically see the two ways how we usually do that with untyped forms. The first possibility is to have an form element over here, use the form group directive, bind our to-do form to it, and then for the input, we can use the form control name directive by supplying just a string that's available as control in the to-do form. As you can imagine, there is no safety here, and this is very prone to typos. The other way is basically to use the form control directive and to supply a control here. Now the thing is, if I did the natural thing and I thought, okay, I have those controls on my controls object on my form, I could insert it here. So I would go like something like to-do form dot controls, and now I basically have to use that syntax where I say this is the description form. So again, a string. And I should be able to do this. But now I get an error that says type abstract control any is not assignable to type form control. I'm sorry, it might be a little bit small here to read, but basically the problem is a control onto the to form could be any abstract form control. So it could be a form control, it could be a form group or form array. But the form control directive needs a real form control. So the way to do this here now is basically to write a getter and cast this control to the type untyped form control. So as you can see, binding those form controls to the form in untyped forms usually is not really straightforward. Secondly, now if we go to our save method here, we actually wanna call our service there to do service and save the to do with the value from our form. So with form value equals this to do form dot value. But now, as we can see here, this will just be of any type. So absolutely no safety. I don't know what the values of my to do forms are going to be. Another problem, let's say I have my priority form control here. And priority is really, should be a number between 1 and 5 in my template. So let's say I want to create a subscription on value changes of that priority form control, but I forget that the values actually emitted will be of type number. So I've created a getter here for my priority control. Let's say we do this.priority control dot value changes dot pipe. Let's do the subscription directly dot subscribe. We get some value from this. It will be any. Now we think, priority control emits strings. So what about value dot substring? And we're gonna say, I want just the last letter of that. So let's go value dot length -1. So that seems fine, but don't get an error yet. But when I add it to do now and somebody enters, let's say 3 for priority, I will get an error at runtime that says value substring is not a function. So as you can see, overall, quite a lot of problems, both from developer experience as from type safety. Now, this is really where typed forms come into play. They are the integration of form structures, namely the reactive forms module, into TypeScript's strongly typed environment. Values will not longer be implicitly typed as any. This will make creating larger forms significantly easier and less error prone, and refactoring will be made much more easy. As I've mentioned, by migrating to Angular 14 or a higher version, the previous untyped form elements will be migrated to untyped counterparts. That makes it possible to adapt typed forms step by step. Let's have a look at the various form elements and how they benefit from being typed. Now, the form control is the most basic of them. And we can now type a form control implicitly or explicitly. Implicit typing means the form control will infer its type from the initial value, in this case, an empty string. But I can also type it explicitly by providing a generic parameter. You might wonder, why does the empty string here lead to a form control of value of union type string or null? This is because in a form control, just as before, we can call .reset on any form controls, and those will be set to null. If we don't want this to happen, then we have the new non-nullable true option, which will exclude null from the union type. And if we now call .reset, we'll actually have a form control that resets to the initial value rather than to null. If you want to take advantage of Form Builder and creating forms in a more concise way than with the new keyword, then you now can use non-nullable Form Builder. That will result in all form controls being non-nullable out of the box. The value of the properties of the form control, .value changes will now all be typed accordingly. And if we use methods such as .patch value, it will only accept values that satisfy the typing of the form control. Often we don't need explicit typing, but sometimes explicit typing will be very necessary. For instance, if we want to start off with a form control being null, but we later want to assign another value, such as a string, we have to use explicit typing. The form group. The form group is, as we know, a collection of form controls, form arrays, or form groups. It can also be implicitly or explicitly typed. Explicit typing is providing a form interface as a generic parameter. The .value property on the form group will no longer be any, but now will be of type partial of the whole value object of the form controls. Why partial? This is because we can call disable on any controls that will not be taken into the value object. If we want all fields also disabled, we have to use .getRawValue. Now, as we'll see in a minute, we can very, very easily access single controls through the typed controls object. Before typed forms came along, form group also was used a lot for dynamic purposes. Now the Angular team created a new form record class as a dynamic equivalent to form group. There we can use methods such as add control or remove control at runtime. Lastly, we have the form array. The form array is a dynamic collection of form controls form groups or form arrays that are accessible by their index. We again have implicit or explicit typing. Implicit typing here means that we start off the form control already with members in the form control array, like in this case. Explicit typing means providing the generic type for the members of the form array. We need this, for instance, when we want to start off with an empty control array. Just as before, we add new members to the form array with .push that now have to satisfy the value type. Now let's have a look at how we add goals in our app and how I used type forms to do this in a more elegant manner. Sorry. Problems with the sliding here. 1 second. Okay. If we go to more goals, we basically here have our list of goals that looks very similar to the to-dos. The only difference is now that instead of notes, we have milestones. And milestones is a dynamic collection of both dates and text. But then if we add a goal, the form overall looks very similar again. So let's have a look at the goals add component. Just close those here. Goals add component over here. And we have the initialization of the goal form right up here. Now, as you can see, here I've used both implicit and explicit typing. For example, title up here is a new form control with initial value of empty string and non-nullable. So implicit typing. If I hover here over title, I will see the form control of type string because we excluded null. Description doesn't exclude null. So if you hover over description, we see the union type. For priority, I wanted to start off with value null, but then be able to assign a number value later. With U2, it was similar, but for date and null. And milestones is a form array with empty controls. And I said every member of the control now must be a form group with text that is form control string and date form control date. So now how does the binding of our form controls to the inputs look like? If we go here, we see that it's now become much, much easier. We can just use the form control directive and directly access the typed controls object of the goal form. And with IDE support, I even get auto-completion here, and I can just choose title. You can imagine how much easier that makes the development of larger forms. And now, for instance, if we say we want this subscription again on our priority control, let's go this.goalform.controls.priority.value changes and subscribe to this. Now, if I type value.substring, I will immediately get an error telling me property substring does not exist on type number, and the app would not compile. So as you can see, those are just a couple of the big advantages that working with type forms brings. Nice. So let's go to the second point, second chapter of this talk, which will be about standalone components. When we talk about standalone components, I really mean standalone components, pipes, and directives. Those can now exist independently of an ng module. That naturally reduces the need to create ng modules. And as we'll see, it's even possible to set up your application without ng modules at all. Standalone components are imported, no longer declared, in an existing ng module or in other standalone components. They remain optional and can be gradually adopted in your application. Creating a new Angular app will not set it up with standalone components is still an option. And concerning routing, we also can get rid of routing ng modules if all paths that we use in our routing for our routes use standalone components. We're going to see that in a minute. How do we create standalone components, pipes, directives? Very easy, we just have to use the standalone true property in the metadata of our component pipe or directive. That means the object that is supplied right after our main annotation. With the CLI, we use the standalone flag to create a standalone component. And if we want to bootstrap our app from a component in our main TS file instead of the .bootstrap module, we can now use the .bootstrap application method. Cool. So now let's have a look again at the goals of the application and how I use the standalone concept there. Here we have again the goals add component. And as we can see here in the metadata of our component, we have the standalone true flag set. The same is true for our goals overview component and the goal component, that is one single goal in our overview. As we can see here now, each of that components imports all the modules it needs separately. So it becomes very evident what each component needs. And now we're going to have a look at the routing. If I go to our app routing module, we'll see that for to-dos, we're still doing routing the old way by importing our to-dos module here. And to-dos module knows of to-dos routing module. But with goals, we are immediately importing goals routes, which, if I find it here, is just a regular TS file that exports goals routes. And that works because the components here in all paths are standalone components. Cool. Now we've seen how the structure of your app can benefit from standalone components and can get more evident. Now let's go to the third chapter of this talk, which is effective state management. And in particular, how we can manage the state in our app by using the very popular NgRx library. The NgRx library is built on the Redux library and uses the concept of a store. So we will first have to get a little bit into that before we can jump into NgRx. What is a store? A store is an object that contains all your application state, thus providing a single source of truth for your front end. Now, having that set up, components can subscribe to slices of that state and consume data reactively whenever it's changed. This will help in reducing coupling tremendously between components, as they no longer, in many cases, talk to each other, but through a centralized store. And most importantly, problems with consistency in your app can be mitigated. Imagine, for example, that a component user interaction within a component makes changes to the state that you immediately want to display in another component. With the store, through the consummation of the slices of data reactively, it's made possible that this happens without direct communications between the components. Now, the Redux pattern. Redux originally was developed for React at Facebook and has been then also been applied to other JavaScript frameworks such as Angular. The first thing that happens in the Redux pattern is that an interaction within the UI leads to the dispatching of a so-called action. Next, our store contains so-called reducers. Those reducers listen to certain dispatched actions and then have the duty of computing a new updated state and replacing the old state with it. They do this based on the current state, based on the custom logic that is part of the reducer, and possibly based also on data that's sent together with the dispatched action. Now, the new state is also fed back into the reducers as basis for coming calculations. And now, having created a new state, a UI component can easily draw in new data and get updated reactively. Now we are ready to talk a little bit about NgRx. NgRx Store is the most popular solution for state management with Redux in Angular. With NgRx, we have another important concept, effects. There, side effects can take place, for instance, calling a service, and effects can also dispatch new actions. Within effects, actions are handled as observable streams with the reactive RxJS library. We will see this in a moment. And then also with NgRx, there are other projects. There is Router Store, which adds router actions that we can listen to in effects and create side effects to, such as having navigated to a new page. And there's NgRx Entity that provides an optimal data model, namely an array of IDs and a map of entities, helping you reduce your reducer logic. There's a common criticism of NgRx to be too bulky, just to having too many parts, too much code to maintain, and not being very beginner-friendly. This is why some more lightweight alternatives have sprung up, like NgXS or Akita, but they remain much less popular than NgRx. Nice. So now we're gonna have a look again at how we fetch to-dos in our app using NgRx. Just as a very, very simple example to show you the different parts of NgRx and how that works out. So, as you can see here up right at the top of the app folder, we have our plus state folder that now contains the various stores we have implemented here. So we can go to the to-do store and see we have to-dos actions, effects, reducer, and selectors. First, let's have a look at to-dos reducer. I'm sorry, I wanted to start with the goals. Reduces is the next thing. With the goals. So let's go to our goals reducers. Up here, we see that we define the state interface for our goal store. Everything it will contain is just an array of goals called goals that we need for our goal overview page. And then we'll create initial state, telling what's the initial state of this goal store. And it will just be an object containing an empty array for goals. Now, before we go further down in this file, let's have a look at goals.actions. Here we define the various actions we can dispatch from the UI of our application, starting with load goals, that just is a string type, but no data sent with it. We have load goals success, that actually will send an array of goals. And we have load goals failure, that can just send an error of type any. So when we go now to our goals overview component, we can see that I've chosen to dispatch load goals in NgOnInit of this page. So every time the page gets loaded, we will automatically load all the goals. What happens next? We said dispatching an action will lead to the reducers listening to them. So let's have a look back at the goals reducer file. Here we have our reducer function. The reducer function first takes our initial state and then has a series of on callback functions, in this case only one, that then state which action they listen to. As we can see here, our only on callback function listens to load goals success. So when we dispatch load goals, nothing will happen here with the reducer. But as we remember, there is this other place for side effects called goals.effects. And now in goals effects, we can create a group of effects. Here again, we only have one effect that I called load goals. And now, not unsimilar to the reducer, we only listen to certain actions here. And in fact, here with NgRx off type operator, we listen to goals actions load goals. So when we dispatch load actions, load goals, then this effect will be triggered. What happens next? We'll have a service call, the service get goals, and the result will be fed back into dispatching load goals success. So now our effect has actually dispatched an action. If we have a problem with our service call and we get an error, then catch error will kick in and dispatch the failure action instead. This is a very common pattern in NgRx, to have this action plus success plus failure action that allows us to do our service calls inside effects, which is very elegant. So now we can say the component doesn't even have to call the service. Now we dispatch load goals success. What happens next? Of course, the reducer. And here we say, now we have a reducer callback function that listens to goals success. And what it does now is to return a new state object. Because the state is immutable by design, we have to use the spread syntax to copy it and then only replace the goals. So now actually we've come the way from dispatching load goals and from having our new goals in our store. So now how do we select actually? How do we select our slice of store? For this, we have to go to the selectors and see here that we have a get goals selector that basically says, please return me state.goals. And if we go to the goals overview component, we'll see that inside the constructor, we assign a variable of observable goal array type to the result of selecting this. And together with the async pipe, we now consume our store data reactively. And we can see this when we go to our app here, go to the goals, we can actually use Redux DevTools with Chrome, also enabled by NgRx. And we can see it here that when loading this page, first load goals was dispatched and then load goal success was dispatched. And if we click here, right, we'll see the structure of our goals in the tree chart. Very nice. So now we are going, as we've seen now, how we can use NgRx in this basic manner. I also want to just quickly talk about NgAccess, as it is one of the alternatives to NgRx and reduces boilerplate code significantly. How does it do that? It uses a lot of annotations and a more object-oriented approach. We have in NgAccess a store class that incorporates what in NgRx are reducer effects and selectors into one class. Therefore, it's possible with the reducing process to use dependency injection. What in NgRx reduces, unfortunately, is not possible. With action handlers that are annotated with add action, they are for state reducing and side effects. We have selectors annotated with selector, also methods in this state class. But very often we don't need a selector in NgXS, but can use just an add select statement in our component. And this is how that could look like with our to-do state. First, this is our state class. We have our state decorator that gets state model and then defines defaults values up here. We have an action handler that now is equivalent in our case to our load to-dos effects, but we could also manipulate the state here. We would need another load to-dos success action too. I've omitted it here. And as we can see, actions are actually classes that get dispatched, so a more object-oriented approach on this. And then in the component, instead of writing a selector, we could just use an add select statement annotation by referring to our to-do state. And because we have to-dos as a property in the state, we can then just say a variable with the name to-dos $ will be assigned to the selected state. And out of convention, NgXS knows that we want to-dos. So we need no further assignment in our constructor. So people at Square have used NgXS and some prefer it. Lots of people go with the much more popular NgRx, but I think they're very equivalent. You have to know all the concepts in both. The amount of code you're writing maybe is a little bit less in NgXS. Now for finishing up my talk, I'd like to talk a little bit about new features in Angular 15. And it was brand new and has been released just 3 weeks ago. So what are some of the features of Angular 15? The biggest new feature is the so-called directive composition API. That enables you to apply directives on the host of a component from within a component. So if I had the same component over and over in my app, and I'd need to always apply a directive on it, now I can do it just from within the component once. Then we have the ng-optimized image directive that's now been made stable. You use it by using ng-source instead of source in your image tags. And it gives some benefits, such as giving fetch priority to the largest picture in the viewport, and also giving out a warning if the set width and height dimensions of the image would result in a distorted picture. We have the new provide router API that makes it now possible to set up the root route of your Angular application without ng modules. We have functional router guards. In simple cases, they can even replace a can activate guard. For instance, when in a can activate guard, we only looked at a logged in function and called that, we can now just use that with the can activate property of a route and write our function as a callback there. And the Angular team has worked on better stack traces in Chrome DevTools together with the Chrome DevTools team, with the goal of reducing the number of errors we're getting from node modules and having more information about what user interaction actually caused an error. So with this, I thank you very much. I hope you got some insights into those aspects of Angular. And if you didn't know about standalone components, about typed forms, and about NgRx, that you now feel interested in them and going to check them out. I also want to announce the next Brainfood Talk by my nice colleague Thomas, who'll be talking about non-blocking I/O under the hood, which will take place on the 13th of January, again at 12 p.m. And with this, I go back to Lisa, and I hope we still have a little bit time for questions. Thanks a lot.
Okay, so welcome back. Thanks, Lawrence, for your really interesting and informative talk. And yes, sure, I've got some questions for you. So let me start by the first one, which is asked by ERA. And the user asks, now that there are modules not really necessary anymore, when setting up a new Angular application, would you still use them for any use case? And if so, why?
Great question. As far as I understand, we really don't need ng modules anymore. Sometimes it's necessary to import, obviously, ng module like reactive forms module, something that Angular built, but we don't need to set up any ng modules anymore in our application. As far as I understand it, I haven't tried that out myself, so take this with a grain of salt. But as far as I understand, it's not necessary anymore.
Great, that makes the code even more readable afterwards, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Okay, so a second question from the same user is, when talking about putting logic into NgRx store effects, how do you decide if you use effects or call the service from the component directly? Does it increase reusability and is it easy to follow?
It depends a little bit on your architecture choices. Both has the pros and cons, so to speak. We've now really adopted this kind of action plus success plus failure action pattern. So we have a clear pattern to follow. And we always know, I don't want to call services from my component directly, but we can always find that in our effects. But if you decide against it and say, oh, we just have too much, we have too much actions, because it obviously increases the number of actions and complexity in the store that you have. If you say that's just too much actions, too much effects, then you can totally have your service call in your application, in your component. That's also the basic Redux schema without having effects. So I think it's basically more a choice of taste, basically, but one that primarily helps to have clear patterns and increase the overall consistency of your code base. About reusability, that could be a point. Could be easier to say, okay, if I have load goals, I always have that there. And it's, I don't have, let's say, 5, 6 service calls where all the places I need goals. But I can have that once in my effect. So I would say it's maybe easier to refactor in this regard.
Okay, thanks a lot. So I hope Lawrence answered your questions well. For me, he did. Let's move on to the next question. It is written by Paul, and Paul asks, what would be the suggestions regarding upgrading a decently sized application to the latest Angular version? Do you upgrade to every new version quickly, or do you prefer waiting for more options?
I would say it depends. It depends to some degree on the needs of your application. So we, for example, were very eager to upgrade to Angular 14 as it provided with typed forms a huge benefits to developers, and it was kind of a pain point for us to go through working with untyped forms. With Angular 15, for instance, I'd say the improvements are nice, but not in such a way that for our use cases, I say we have to jump right on it and go to the next version. And as far as I understand the Angular team, because there are lots of teams and projects in older versions, they're very conscientious about making new versions such in a way that you can also easily upgrade from versions that are not just one version number behind, but maybe 2 or 3. So my personal preference were to assess if we actually need that new kind of functionality right away, or if it gives big security points that I also don't see with Angular 15, rather than to jump on the next version right away.
Absolutely, I also share this opinion on this one. So yes, Paul has written another question, and he asks, do you see Angular as the go-to framework for new projects, or do you evaluate more lightweight single-page applications frameworks as well?
Very much. It's a little bit difficult for me because my main focus has really been Angular, and I don't have so much experience now with other frameworks. I do have some experience with React. I would say Angular is still a very good choice if you deal with a big project where you need lots of functionality out of the box, want lots of opinionated ways, and as people say, it's just a well suited framework for large enterprise applications. But I would totally encourage trying out other more lightweight frameworks. I would love to work with Svelte or Solid.js, maybe on smaller projects. I don't think they, for example, give all the same capabilities as Angular gives for big projects. But I think it's a case and case thing, yeah.
Okay, thank you. So as there are no more questions anymore, I hope we answered all of them well. And once again, thank you also from the user base. Thank you for the talk. Thank you for listening, and see you again soon. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.